So far in our discussion of grammar, we've essentially been looking at constituency, that is, which parts of a sentence go with which other parts, namely how a phrase is constructed, then how a phrase is ordered into clauses, what sorts of functions are there, and so forth. We've then looked at embedding and seen that a phrase can go inside a phrase, a clause can go inside a clause. But essentially all these have been rules of constituency. We're now going to look at something which we hinted at when we looked first at what makes a phrase a phrase. We said that things that stay together when they're moved are phrases. We're now going to have a look at relationships that come about when constituents are moved. And we're going to start with a very simple thing, it would appear to be, that is, how to make a question. Every English speaker, given a statement, can turn it into a question. In every language in the world, people can ask questions. In every case, the question is related in some way to a corresponding statement. In other words, questions are constructed in a rule-governed way. Questions, again, virtually the world over, are of two sorts. There are questions to which the answer is either yes or no. Are you old? Yes or no. Have you had dinner? Yes or no. Yes-no questions have the answer either yes or no. Basically the whole proposition is being questioned. WH questions are when you ask a question about only part of the proposition, part of the sentence. Some of these answers are functional constituents of the clause. For example, we can ask questions about the subject. Who is coming tomorrow? We can ask questions about the object. What are you giving your mother for Christmas? We can ask questions about adverbials. When is your grandma going to arrive? Let's start with yes-no questions. And let's start with the supposition that yes-no questions are made by rules. If we know the statement, we can predict the form of the question. John is eating. What's a yes-no question on that? And there's only one. Is John eating? John is eating. Is John eating? It looks like there's a relationship here. We've taken the auxiliary verb and put it out to the left. Geraldine has dined. Difficult question. What's the yes-no question? Oh, not that difficult. Has Geraldine dined? Pauline might come. You want to ask about that? Might Pauline come? In each case here, we look as though we've got a clear rule. Take the auxiliary verb and put it to the left. These two forms, the statement, were originally called declarative form, and the question is interrogative form. And it looks as though what we've got here is a movement. At least that's a nice way to think about it. You might like to think of movements as involving an extraction site. There is a location somewhere in the grammar from which something is extracted and it's then placed somewhere else, put in a landing site. These are metaphors, of course, but they're quite picturesque. The rules that do this, that pick something up from an extraction site and place it in a landing site, are often called transformations or movement rules. In yes-no questions, the first auxiliary appears to be moved to the left of the subject. So, let's see how good that particular analysis is. Ethne writes letters. What is a yes-no question on that? If we want to question whether that's the case or not, what do we ask? We ask, does Ethne write letters? Something odd has happened. You'll remember that the S on the end of writes, which is in bold here, is the third person singular present inflection. The subject is she, and the verb is present tense, and so when there's a statement we have to put the S inflection on the end of the verb. But in the question, that S inflection has disappeared off the verb and now appears out the front with the verb do. You'll remember we mentioned the verb do when we talked about auxiliaries and said that do appears on occasion when there is no other auxiliary. Well, there is no auxiliary here to move to the front. But what has moved to the front is the tense marker, the third singular present tense marker. Thomas skates on thin ice. No prizes for guessing what the yes-no question is. It is, does Thomas skate on thin ice? And again, the S has moved to the front. So, in this case, since we don't have an auxiliary, what has moved? Well, the third person singular inflection has moved, and the do has come along because there it is, poor old orphaned inflection. It's a bound morpheme, so it needs a stem, and do is coming along to help. We can call this tense movement because when we looked at the auxiliaries, they were also the tensed auxiliaries that got moved to the front. In yes-no questions, tense is moved from the first auxiliary position to a position to the left of the subject. Now I'm taking a very big gamble here and suggesting that you haven't noticed that while the tense is obviously on the first auxiliary when there is a first auxiliary, it's on the main verb when there isn't an auxiliary. Well, I'm going to suppose that the tense is in that first auxiliary position and only ends up on the end of the main verb when it doesn't get moved for a question. So the tense takes the auxiliary verb with it. But it looks as though it can't take a lexical verb. Instead, it moves by itself, and do comes along to help. Right, so that's yes-no question. What about WH questions? Well, when is Marcia coming? What's the statement? Marcia is coming tomorrow. Here we're questioning an adverbial. We don't know when Marcia is coming. We do want to know, and what we want to know is the date, the time. We have a time adverbial that we're questioning. Notice the form of 1a. We've got a WH word, when, out the front, but we also have the first auxiliary, is, out the front as well. What has Marcel brought? Marcel has brought the wine. Here we're questioning the object. Marcel must have brought something, but we don't know what it is, so we ask, what has Marcel brought? And we have a WH word, what, out the front, and the tensed auxiliary, also out the front of the subject. Where will we eat tomorrow? We will eat outside tomorrow. Again, we're questioning an adverbial, where, and the auxiliary is also out in front. But this is a bit peculiar, isn't it? Where will we eat? We will eat where? Yes, no, that's perfectly all right, isn't it? All very rule governed. The WH word goes out to the left, and straight behind it, also out to the left of the subject, is the tensed auxiliary. So we found the relationship. It's very neat, isn't it? WH questions seem to be formed by tense movement, because that has happened, as well as the movement of the WH phrase, which we can call an interrogative pronoun, if you like. So, how do we know that the WH phrase has been moved? Well, there's some really neat data that suggests this. The verb to catch, you'll remember, is a transitive verb. It requires an object. The cat has caught what? Well, there isn't anything after caught, but we know that it's what. Let's just prove that. The cat caught the bird. That's fine. Now caught has an object, but in fact it has two objects, because what is also the object, and of course that's ungrammatical. Purring doesn't allow an object. Cats just purr, they don't purr anything. So if we put an object in the form of a WH word out the front, then that's horribly ungrammatical. Right, so we now have two sorts of questions, and where better to find questions being used than by the greatest detective of all time, Sherlock Holmes. And here is Sherlock Holmes talking with Dr. Watson, his friend. Dr. Watson, for those of you who haven't met him, is not as bright as Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes, the great detective, has a friend, but the friend isn't very bright. And he's telling him about his brother Mycroft. When I say, therefore, that Mycroft has better powers of observation than I, you may take it that I am speaking the exact and literal truth. Well, it's now time for Watson to ask a question, and this is what he asks. Is he your junior? So what sort of question is that? It's a yes-no question. And the answer is either yes or no. But the great detective tells Watson, no, you shouldn't have asked a yes-no question. You should have asked, how much older or younger than you is he? Because great detectives ask really seriously detailed questions. Here's Watson again, poor chap. He's taken the message. He now asks a WH question. How comes it that he's unknown? And Sherlock Holmes says, oh, he is very well known in his own circle. Telling Watson that he's asked the wrong question again. He should have asked a yes-no question, because this is the answer to a yes-no question. And Watson gets exasperated and asks a WH question. Where then? And Holmes, being a nice chap, gives him the answer to his question. Well, in the Diogenes Club, for example. And Watson is now thoroughly peeved with Holmes and says, I never heard of this institution, and my face must have proclaimed as much, for Sherlock Holmes pulled out his watch, and off they go. So great detectives ask great questions, and poor old Watson's don't quite know what to do. He hasn't been to detective school. We're now going to have a look at the relative clause. We mentioned the relative clause as the embedded clauses you get inside noun phrases to the right of the head noun. The person whom I met yesterday, well, that's an embedded clause, and you'll notice that there's a WH thingy out the front. I met someone yesterday. It's the object of the verb met, but it's been moved to the front, and it's a pronoun, so it's often called a relative pronoun because it's in a relative clause. So what have we got here? We have a WH word which has been moved to the left of the subject. Relative clauses are introduced by relative pronouns, which are WH words, but the relative pronoun has been moved from object position in this case because I met someone. The someone would have been the someone who you met, direct object. Direct objects come after verbs. So the relative pronoun has been moved. But what else has happened? Whoops, there's been no movement of the tense. So what have we got here? We've got two movements. We've got the movement of the tense to the front of yes-no questions, and also to the front of WH questions. We've got WH movement, which moves things out of the clause and into the complementizer position. Right. So we've got two different movements. When neither of them happen, you've got an ordinary statement. When tense movement happens, you have a yes-no question. When WH movement and tense movement happen, you have a WH question. And finally, when only WH movement takes place, you have a relative clause. That's a very efficient use of two different movements, because whether or not you use them, you've got the choice in both cases. You have four different constructions: ordinary, declarative, plain, word order, two different questions, and relative clauses, all being done by moving things to the left of the subject or leaving them in place.